Hi everyone. So if we get going then, thank you. A very warm welcome to Lane 4's webinar this afternoon on virtual teams, how to keep teams connected and engaged. We had a webinar running last week on Thursday actually. I think a number of you have joined that. Some of you I'm hoping are brand new to us. That one was on leading virtual teams. We're going to be running a webinar each Friday, and in that what we asked people to do during the webinar was to send in anything that they wanted advice or tips on of ways of working over the coming period. And some of that was that they wanted some really tangible, actionable tips on how to keep people connected and engaged as we get going in this new normal. So that's what we're aiming to do with this one. Just a couple of practicalities before we get going. As some of you might have heard Jack saying, there's a chat box on the right-hand side. Please add in questions, comments as we go through. If you click on send to all panelists, because what myself and my colleague Chris will do is save some time at the end for a bit of a Q&A. So I'm conscious that not everyone listening is necessarily going to be that familiar with Lane 4. A very quick intro. We're a management consultancy and we focus on people performance. So quite simply, we work with our clients and with businesses to support them in improving organisational performance. And fundamentally, we exist to make a positive difference to people's working lives. And so before we probably get stuck into the stuff that quite frankly you're most interested in, I'll do a quick introduction to myself, my colleague Chris, who we're hosting the webinar today. So I'm in charge of slides here as well. So let me just flick through to those. Here we are. So I'm Emma Rowe. I'm a key account director at Lane 4. So what that is I work across a number of teams as well as consulting with clients. I've got quite a bit of experience in working in virtual teams, but my job is all about people. I guess that's why I love what I do. And last week I've gone from working with people to living on my own and moving to a fully virtual world. So it's highlighted more than ever that importance and need really to focus on what does team engagement and connection look like now. Chris, if I just hand over to you to introduce yourself and what we're covering on the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Afternoon, everyone. Delighted that so many of you can join. Matt Walker, who messaged us with a slightly scared sounding message saying, is it just me? Matt, don't worry, I think there's about just over 200 signed on, so we're not ganging up on you. I've been at Lane 4 for just over 14 years. I've been involved in helping shape some of our product and content around leading virtual teams. And yeah, as Emma said, delighted to be able to build on last week's session and be with you today. The famous phrase, a week is a long time in politics, feels like it's true for all of us. I can't believe it's been a week of us operating in this new normal that Emma referenced. And Emma, if you could move the slides on back one, if that's okay. So this was, or is, the Lane 4 office, and I'm looking longingly at it and the place that I normally sit. This is one side of the office, and I think, yeah, me, as with you, trying to adjust to what it's feeling like to work, and I have to be honest, I'm looking forward to the weekend. It's been a long week. My learning about this new normal, yeah, juggling real life alongside working life and how those two bump into each other. I've got a 6-year-old daughter and had a couple of moments this week where, I don't know if people can remember the famous BBC interview where a guy was on a video link and his child runs around in the background. I've had a bit of that happening and trying to manage that. Trying to manage energy, trying to manage hot ears from earphones being on 8 hours, and trying to manage unreal explosions of WhatsApp and email chats. So with all of those things in mind, I guess we have built on last week as content to be thinking that, recognizing that for you as people tuning in are going to be either leading or part of or potentially working with, consulting with teams who are trying to navigate this adjustment at pace to working virtually. And so we want to reiterate and recognize some of the challenges that are being faced by virtual teams. From there, we want to build on themes from last week and pay particular attention. So if we go back to some of the ideas around connection and engagement, the cliched phrase, it's all about communication, is also a truism. So being able to think about a structure and a lens to give you around being really thoughtful and deliberate and planful about the communication that you are going to be, the different channels that you're going to be able to communicating with your team with. And so, yeah, designed to hopefully give you practical tips that are going to help you on this engagement and connection piece that we've referenced here on this final objective. So hopefully that's what you signed up for, and I'm going to pass back to Emma now to bridge us into the next part of our session today.
Great, thanks, Chris. So yeah, as Chris says, before we get stuck into those that practical tips and advice, we thought it would be useful just to look at fundamentally what's important for teams, but then specifically what's unique about that virtual landscape. And regardless of whether your team, you're co-located or you're virtual, there's two fundamental building blocks of those effective teams, and that's around task cohesion and social cohesion. So thinking about task, starting with the end in mind. What do you do? What's your purpose? That goal alignment, that clarity on how you operate. And then there's also that social cohesion, so thinking about human connection, about trust, about care for each other. It's that real depth of relationship amongst different team members. So that, although that's true for both teams, what is it that's really specific about virtual working? What's different, and what are some of the challenges that can be unique in that context? And so as Lane 4, we've done research for over 20 years on what creates high-performing teams, and over the past couple of years, actually, we've really delved into what does it look like in a virtual landscape, which I think that some of our research showed that in the last decade, there was a 20% increase in virtual working. I imagine our statistic is vastly out of date coming into this week. But that being said, we've categorized those challenges for virtual teams into the areas. Those of you that were on the webinar last week, you'll recognize these. It will just be a brief recap. But those challenges largely fall into those three buckets. It's around processes, around connection, and around leadership. So processes, what channels are you using for what? How do you stop information getting lost? How do you track progress on projects accurately? How do you ensure there's not management information overload? So as Chris said, there's been an explosion of WhatsApp, Microsoft Teams, Skype, email, phone calls, formal channels, informal channels of communication. That can be a challenge for virtual managing those processes. The next one's around connection. And the risk with virtual teams is that you become a collection of meetings. You miss the informal, unplanned opportunities to connect, to collaborate on tasks. And also, when you're virtual, you might miss those subtle, non-verbal social context cues. So for example, I know one of my colleagues, I know that if she's under pressure, I'll see a lot less of her because she'll have gone and isolated herself in one of the booths. So there's all these these tells that you know of people in the physical world, and it's relearning what are their virtual tells. And then finally, that challenge is around leadership, and particularly the research showed that they underestimating the potential that shared leadership can bring to virtual teams. So is that leader feeling like you need to be on top of everything, in control of everything, with all of that information, working in a virtual landscape, you end up being a bottleneck. So to what extent are you empowering different people in your team to take on those leadership roles on different projects? And ultimately, it's about shifting your view from that just as the leader to that as a facilitator. So that's some of what we've said, important for teams around social and task, and some of those challenges faced by virtual teams, the process, connection, and leadership. And Chris, you mentioned at the beginning there around that phrase of it is all about communication. And that's vitally important when we're doing this topic of connection and engagement. So when Chris and I were planning this webinar, we were trying to think of what's a nice framework that people can hold lightly in terms of thinking about what does that look like for engagement and connection of their team. And so what we want to do is bring to life a model that we often use with our clients, whether it's looking at organizational communication or just thinking of that for your team. So you can see it there as our communication grid. And it focuses on you know, the structured, planned containment of information to more unstructured, the spontaneity, the emergent communication. And then the other two axes is really looking at whether that's formal, so thinking about the emphasis on message passing, or the informal, it's the sense making, it's the relational building. So I guess that informal is really where that engagement part fits into. So I'll just talk you through these 4 quadrants, and then I'll hand over to Chris, who's really going to delve more into some of the tips and the advice that I know people were keen to come onto this webinar for. So thinking about that C1 there, that conventional, like, it's usually the one-way communication. So think businesses update on what COVID-19 means to your business. It's a message transmit. The fundamentals for this, kind of ask yourself, what do I need people to understand? How do I want them to feel? What is the call to action off the back of that? So that's your C1. And then your C2 communication. These are more of your meetings. This is the opportunity to sense make, to problem solve, for people to feel like they are actively involved in the decision making. So think what structures do you have in place for this? How do these meetings play out? What might need to change now you're moving to a virtual landscape? I'm going to leave it there because that's the area that Chris is really going to focus the next section on. Let me just lightly touch on the last two there. So there's C3, and C3, that's what people really think. So when we're consulting with clients, we'll sometimes talk about, you've got 3 different conversations going on. You've got the conversation that you have in the room, and then you've got the conversation that you have over a coffee break, and then you've got the conversation, all the thoughts going on in your head. And for us, success as a consultant is to make sure there's an alignment between all 3 of those. So what happens in organizations, C3, this is the stuff where you really pick up how people are feeling. You know, it's the everyday conversations, the unplanned, rich conversations that give you context on what's going on for people. So questions to ask yourself, now maybe you've moved recently to fully virtual, you know, have you planned in this time? What channels, processes are you working for to do that? Are you actually making sure that there's that opportunity for that level of connection? And then finally there's C4, and it's about role modeling. And so this is formal because it is message passing. So whether you realize it or not, you're always communicating something. So what your behaviors and your actions are actually saying is that's what's expected around here. These are the standards I hold myself, hold others to. So think about something I'm really reflecting actually this week for myself is, what's the impact on others when I'm sending emails at 10 p.m. at night? Try this out. Be the first person to turn your video on when you go onto a chat and see what the impact is on. Start to see everyone else's faces coming on. You know, start a meeting by asking how people are. Share a personal story actually of how you're doing. You know, are you finding this difficult? Are there, you know, your own struggles? Chris has just talked about trying to manage a co-located workspace with his daughter now. So we often use this communication grid as a structure to think about connection and engagement of my people. How have I got different processes, and what am I communicating in each of these different quadrants? Just to bring this to life actually, so with one of the teams that I work with at the moment, we're used to working really flexibly. We're often virtual, but we do have like regular face-to-face connection points. And so this last couple of weeks, we've moved to working fully virtual. We've gone through kind of our well-established connection points as a team, opened up the diary invites, clicked on that button that adds your virtual meeting, cracked on as usual. And it probably took me about to the beginning of this week to realise a very obvious point is that it's not just our formal meetings that make us successful as a team. There's all these other communication points, these connection points we have. And as soon as we went virtual, there was a risk that these had been lost. So we had to re-establish some of like kind of the rituals and routines we've put in. Every other day we've got 11s for 20 minutes at 11, where we just have kind of a check-in on how people are feeling. We, you know, the other evening we put in like just a games night between us. We had a meeting with our client yesterday, and we spent the first part of the client just saying, what's really going on for you? What's this new normal? What are you noticing in your business and your leaders? What are you noticing in yourself? It was just changing actually what was true and worked and was brilliant in co-located space. We've now had to change those using this communication grid came to for our new virtual landscape that we find ourselves in. So Chris, if I pass over to you, because I know I've only lightly hit on that C2 section there around that structured dialogue. I know that's the area that you were going to focus on bringing to life a little bit more.
Yeah, it feels like we have fulfilled our consulting oath by sharing a 4-box model. So that's one done. I know that from looking at some of the names attending today, some of you will be more familiar with this than others. As Emma was saying, we want to focus now around this C2 element, because I think a real gem that came out of last week's session, a sort of phrase from Paul and Emma, was this idea that teams are more than just meetings. So of course they are. So thinking back to that task and social cohesion that's required, and at the same time is recognizing that the formal meetings that teams have when they are coming together and working on generating output around their priorities is a real performance moment for the team, and it's often a real barometer of the health of the team. So we want to spend some time now just looking at a structure around team meetings. Again, it's common sense. It holds true as much in a co-located, so when you're face-to-face, as it does in a virtual context. But I think as we're going to talk through, it's the mechanism of experiencing some of this structure in a virtual context that is the real difference and what we have to pay attention to. So you can see the 5 steps here. So it comes from the work of Roger Schwartz, who's written a couple of books, The Skilled Facilitator and Smart Leaders, Smarter Teams. So this was shared by a colleague with me, and I think it's a really useful, simple lens to be thinking about how do I structure those more formal task-based meetings as a team, and how do I ensure that the quality of output is where I need it to be. So I'm just going to step through with bringing to life each of the different elements, and then going to come afterwards sharing some more insight around the behaviours that are required within this structure to ensure that it's successful, so the what and the how. So the first part, as it says here, and again, this is common sense. My challenge to all of you is, to what extent is it common practice in any of these different sections? So thinking about agreeing a clear purpose for the meeting, having a really clear set of agenda items that are realistic to be able to get through, rather than just as many things as possible that you know realistically you're going to talk about 1/3 of, and the other 2/3 always fall off the bottom. A clear set of objectives and a clear criteria for success. So I think, again, very obvious, simple tips, but taking that into a virtual context, I think becomes even more important to prepare the ground to ensure that people are aligned around what the purpose of the meeting is. So what you don't necessarily have the luxury of is being able to bump into people and have those more informal conversations that are helping position what you might want to be getting out of the meeting. So for you as the leader or someone who's leading a meeting, how is it that you can prepare the ground, as I said, to ensure that, yes, the agenda is circulated, but not just in the sense of a transactional set of bullets, but what are the really big questions that you want people to have views on, so they can come prepared in the meeting to be able to share their views and perspectives, and are required to, actually. So it becomes almost like an ethical violation of the team dynamic if people haven't pre-thought through what it is they're going to share, because as the leader of the team, you're going to be ensuring that you get as many views as possible. So that's around the purpose. So from there, to be thinking about how you, as the leader, but also if you're working within a team, how you can ensure the right conversations happen to shape the process to ensure that the purpose are fulfilled. So that may be around who leads in different sections of the meeting, whether that's an SME or whether that stays as the leader of the team or the person who's chairing that. How are we going to gauge if we've successfully met the objective? So agreeing those definitions of success that we talked about earlier on. What are some of the ground rules and some of the disciplines that I know Paul and Emma talked about last time to ensure that people stay present and don't be lured into the idea of I can just flick onto emails. So simple, practical hygiene things around ensuring that the videos can be used so you can see people, as well as actively drawing people into the conversation at every point to ensure there's equal contribution is a key part of making sure that that purpose and process elements are set up well. And I think spending time in those two elements then allows these second three areas to be worked through much more smoothly, because once the purpose is clear, once the process is clear, it then allows a really healthy, iterative conversation around the content where everyone is able to make their contributions, share their perspectives, ultimately to contribute to some clear decisions that people can commit to afterwards. So in that commitment stage, what people are going to be clear on is being able to understand what the decisions are that have been made, what the next steps are that are going to be agreed, and the RACI around that. So who's accountable, who's responsible. And that's really important to document. Going back to some of the challenges that Emma talked about, some of the process challenges where across multiple different mediums, sometimes that can get lost. So that's the content and commitment section. And then finally, just jumping through to the review section, having done all of those things, taking time within that meeting structure to be able to review the what and the how. So the task element, so to what extent were objectives met, that we followed the process that we signed up for, the quality of the decisions are ones that we're happy with and that we can all stand behind. And then I think there's also the element of how it felt to be in the meeting, and I'll share more about that in this next section. But I think that completion cycle, that review process is fundamental. And I think all of these things, as I said, to keep reiterating, are things we'll be familiar with, but I think we have to be so much more disciplined and focused in a virtual context in being able to ensure that everyone understands this is the structure, because I think the luxury of some of the informal cues that Emma was talking about aren't there in the same way. So if we can move on to the next slide, Emma. So alongside that structure, so having that clear structure with those 5 elements, for us also what becomes key in a virtual context are the soft skills that team members and the leader are able to role model and demonstrate and set ground rules around to ensure that, yes, we have the structure, but we can use it really effectively to generate the quality of decisions and outputs that we need to have as a team. So we've bucketed those into these 3 key areas. So I think the first one, again, touching back on the ground that was covered in last week's session. So certainly for Emma and I working with teams, noticing that these 3 things are key. So the first being noticing the type and quality of conversation around the decision-making process, around how people are sharing their views. So it's very easy in this virtual context to lapse into the more transactional task-based conversations. And of course, those are really, really important. And at the same time, they need to be balanced with the more human, person-centered transformational conversations that's referenced here. And going back to those 4 communications areas, paying attention to all of those areas ultimately is going to help you generate this balance of transactional and transformational. But even within this C2 formal task-based or more task-based emphasis of communication, recognizing that there's still room for that human connection. So allowing people the chance to check in with each other before then getting to task as a habit and as a ritual is important. I think a key dynamic is around that we pay attention to is advocacy versus inquiry. So noticing within the team meetings, are you able to take a step back and to look at how much are people just sharing their views, however helpfully intended, versus trying to be curious and get under the skin of what other people are thinking and how they can iterate and build on points, or are they just waiting for a gap in the conversation to force their view in? I think that the risk of too much advocacy is twofold. I think one, it can really undermine the connection and engagement piece. It can flare conflict that can move from sort of task-based conflict actually to more relationship conflict, whereby and so I think to be really attentive and aware of that balance, So whether that's you as the leader and noticing when you're advocating a position as the leader, what tone that sets. And for us, I think you would needing to be able to role model much more curiosity and inquiry to try and help set the tone for what you want to see in the meeting. And then the final piece is around this idea of task and social review. So going back to that final step of the framework, yes, we want to review, did we meet objectives? Did we follow the process, and are we happy with the decision? But at the same time, I think it's really important to review the dynamic of the meeting and how it felt. So are you able to, is each member of the team able to rate the level of advocacy as inquiries? We've talked about the emotional trace through the conversations, where there potentially emotions ran higher than others, and were people picking up on that? Yeah, and other hygiene things around how much people were talking over, really listening, were all voices heard? So hopefully those two things harnessed together are going to enable you to get the most out of that C2 performance moment for the team. And on that, I'll pass back to Emma to wrap us up and take us into questions.
Great, thanks, Chris. So that's really just summarising what we've spoken about. Is teams are not just meetings. So where are your opportunities to focus on the task and the social? Invest time up front, set the team up well, as it says there. So what worked before when you're in that face-to-face landscape might not work now in that virtual landscape. So use that leadership communication grid really to reassess some of those communication channels. Get comfortable being a facilitator as well as that leader, because when you go into this landscape, you've got lots of different people on the line. How do you ensure that people are brought into the conversation, having a voice, feel listened to, heard, involved in decision making? And finally, a phrase that we often use with our clients is every contact leaves a trace. So thinking about that leadership role modeling, thinking about that caring for those that are in your team, what are the traces that you're choosing to leave in the way that you're communicating in the landscape? So I'm conscious of time. I'm also conscious of making sure that you've got the support you need and answered questions. And what we've got, if you're interested, we've got a number of online resources. Please get in touch on the social media. Have a look on our website. We've got lots of different free resources to support you. And equally, if you want further support in terms of virtual programs in this area, diagnostics and tools for your team, your organisation, please get in touch and we can do more about those. So Chris, I think we've got time for a couple of questions there. I know you've just been looking through. I can see the questions coming through on the chat. If I hand over to you to pick one out there, please.
Yeah, so just looking back, I think there was a question from Mark. Right now, a large portion of the country are working from home and other stresses. How do you think this will evolve or change the approaches to remote working, which would be starting to be worked through pre-corona? Yeah, I mean, I think my answer to this, Mark, would be it's back to the role modeling piece that Emma talked about. So as someone working with teams or as part of a team or leading a team, acknowledging and paying attention to those things and being able to have the conversations around them to enable the team to ensure people aren't feeling guilty, that you are setting the right tone, in having to, because they're the reality of all of us that are having to deal with, you know, going back to my introduction. So I think I would stimulate, I think it's something that's going to stay with us to have to navigate. So on that basis, it would be about teams, shaping how they work within those constraints and recognizing some of the outside commitments and that blur becoming, I guess, more acute in the current context.
Great, thanks, Chris. There's another one here from Suzanne saying, hi, what tips would you share for virtual team sessions when there are lots of people on it, i.e. 50 to 100? Thanks. So Suzanne, thinking about that one, it's interesting using the word team and also saying 50 to 100 people. The question would be really, are you a team? So if I go back to that communication grid, I'll be thinking about what is the purpose of that session with 100 people. I mean, 50 to 100 people, I imagine there might be a need of more of that C1 communication. So starting off thinking, what do I want them to understand? What do I want them to feel? What do I want them, what's the call to action? What do I want them to do about it? And then finding out what are the subgroups that you could have in there. To say this was a leadership forum, what we would tend to do would find a number of different sub-leaders within there and maybe create them some form of guidance on how they can then transfer this to C2 communication using the process that Chris talked about previously. How can they then get people to work out what they made sense of, feel involved in the decision-making process and feel that they're being listened to and heard? It's very difficult to facilitate something virtually with 50 to 100 people. There's lots of really cool technology out there that looks at doing that. So get in touch if you want to talk through some of those, and we can share some of the stuff that we do, you know, with virtual conferences. But mine would be work out what the purpose of it is, what you're trying to achieve, and then have a look at what are the different ways that you could evolve the C1 and the in
Thanks,
that.
Emma. Thank you. I can sense the Oscars acceptance speech music coming. We're 2 minutes over, so yeah, we're going to wrap it up here. All of the questions that we haven't been able to answer, we'll make sure that we answer and circulate as we did last week. Emma, if you could just jump us on to the final slide. So just to remind all of you of the different channels that you can hear more about this and other things that we're doing, and just to remind you that we're putting on a series of webinars every Friday. They're going to be in support of the turbulent world that we're currently living in. So please, sign up for next week's webinar. I believe it's around wellbeing and resilience. Have a fantastic rest of the afternoon. Enjoy your weekends. Catch your breath. Next week is a new week. And yeah, thank you for spending the time with us this afternoon.